There is a place in the English countryside, 7,000 acres of Wiltshire downland, fenced off from the world, that the British government has operated in secret for over 100 years. More than 25,000 British servicemen passed through its gates. Most believed they were helping find a cure for the common cold. Were not. Britain's programme of human chemical and biological warfare experimentation at Porton Down is, by documented record, the longest-running programme of chemical warfare testing on human subjects of any nation on Earth. The United States tested approximately 1,100 soldiers between 1945 and 1975. Canada tested a small number before 1968. Britain tested over 20,000 people across 5 decades with nerve agents, mustard gas, hallucinogens, and biological agents. No other country comes close. We are counting down the 10 most significant and documented experiments conducted on British servicemen without their full knowledge or consent, and the institutions that buried the evidence for half a century. There are things that need to be said before the first name is spoken. Porton Down was not a rogue operation run by criminal scientists in defiance of their government. The experiments conducted there were authorized, funded, and in many cases directly requested by ministers, by the War Office and by the Cabinet. The deception used to recruit volunteers was not a local improvisation, it was a documented, recurring practice that internal government correspondence acknowledged as misleading and then continued regardless. And when men died, or suffered, or came forward decades later with broken health and unanswered questions, the institutional response was consistent across every decade: deny, delay, classify, and wait for the men to stop asking. The oldest of those men are now gone. Some of the secrets went with them. Not all of them. These are the ones that didn't. The facility sits just northeast of the village of Porton, near Salisbury, in a stretch of chalk downland that looks, from the outside road, like ordinary English countryside. Low hedgerows, rolling fields, the occasional military vehicle. Nothing to suggest that beneath this pastoral English exterior, Britain has been running the world's most extensive human experimentation program in the history of chemical and biological warfare. It opened in March 1916, established as the War Department Experimental Station, in direct response to what had happened at Ypres on the 22nd of April 1915. That day, the German army released 168 tons of chlorine gas along a 4-mile front. The gas drifted into allied trenches in a yellow-green cloud. Within 10 minutes, over 1,100 allied soldiers were dead. Thousands more were blinded, burned from the inside, left with lungs that never fully healed. Britain had no defense. It had no response. And the men at the top understood, with urgent clarity, that this could never be allowed to happen again. Porton Down was the answer to that emergency. What it eventually became was something else entirely. By the end of the First World War, chemical weapons had killed approximately 90,000 people across the Western Front and injured over 1,300,000 more. Britain emerged from that conflict knowing what chemical warfare could do to a human body. The knowledge was precise. The documentation was extensive. And the facility built to study the problem remained open after the armistice, operating through the 1920s, expanding through the 1930s and accelerating dramatically when the Second World War began. That is the origin story that Porton Down is comfortable telling. But the origin story of what happened to the men inside that one took considerably longer to surface. The first thing you need to understand about how Porton Down recruited its volunteers is that the word volunteer carried a very specific meaning. Men stationed at military bases across Britain received invitations or were approached by officers, or heard through informal channels that there was an opportunity at a research establishment in Wiltshire. The incentive was modest but meaningful for a young serviceman in peacetime, 15 shillings. Sometimes a modest cash payment, always the promise of 3 days of leave. The description of what the research involved was consistent across decades of testimony. They were told they would be helping scientists find a cure for the common cold. That phrase, a cure for the common cold, appears in account after account. From men who went to Porton Down in the 1940s, the 1950s, the 1960s, and beyond. It was not an accident. It was a recruiting line, and for decades, it worked. What the men actually found when they arrived was something different. They were led into gas chambers. They had substances applied to their skin. They breathed agents through masks, or, without masks, they were injected. They were dosed with drugs they could not identify. They were observed, measured, and dismissed. Many signed forms they were not given time to read. Some were told the forms were routine. Almost none were told the actual purpose of the experiment they were about to participate in. An internal government document from 1953, unearthed during the investigation into the death of Ronald Maddison, states the objective of the experiments in unambiguous terms. The object of the experiments, the document reads, was to discover the dosage of sarin, soman, and cyclosarin, which, when applied to the clothed or bare skin of men, would cause incapacitation or death. No evidence emerged at any subsequent inquiry that any volunteer was ever told that was the purpose of the experiment. Not one. The 10 cases that follow are drawn from the documented record. Every date, every name, every number cited here is verifiable. The documents exist. Many are now declassified. Some were released only after sustained legal pressure by veterans and their families. The question they collectively raise is not whether these experiments happened. That is no longer in dispute. The question is why no individual scientist, no commanding officer, no minister, and no government official has ever faced criminal prosecution for any of it. Number 10. The Rawalpindi experiments? 1938. Long before Porton Down became synonymous with nerve agents and Cold War secrecy, Britain was already conducting chemical warfare tests on human beings, under conditions that the participants had no meaningful power to refuse. In 1938, as the Cabinet authorized full offensive chemical warfare research in anticipation of another European war, a series of experiments known as the Rawalpindi trials were conducted on servicemen in the British Indian Army. Mustard gas was the agent being studied. The subjects were placed in conditions where they were exposed to the gas and its effects on the human body were observed and recorded. The burns caused by mustard gas are not ordinary burns. The agent attacks soft tissue with particular intensity. Eyes, skin, the respiratory tract, the groin. Patients exposed to significant doses were, according to contemporary reports, often very miserable and very depressed and in considerable discomfort. Many required hospitalization. The justification offered by Porton Down officials, when the experiments later came to public attention, was that they had taken place in a different era during a period of genuine threat and should not be judged by modern ethical standards. That argument has been repeated in one form or another for every experiment on this list. It has never fully satisfied the men who bore the burns. Number 9. The World War II mustard gas program, 1940–1945. During the Second World War, approximately 8,000 British servicemen were exposed to mustard gas in experiments. Conducted at Porton Down, this was the peak period of the volunteer program by volume. The justification was defensive. Scientists needed to understand the effects of chemical agents on human skin and respiration in order to improve protective equipment. The recruits were told they were participating in tests of gas masks and protective clothing. The word volunteered appears in every official document. What it meant in practice was that men in uniform within a military hierarchy were being asked by officers or approached through chains of command that made refusal both practically difficult and culturally uncomfortable. 8,000 people in 5 years. That is more than for men every single day of the war, placed in gas chambers, exposed to agents that burned their skin and their lungs. For experiments whose full purpose they were not told, the equipment was later improved. The men were not compensated. The records were classified. Number 8. Gruinard Island, 1942. Here is a fact that requires a moment to absorb. In 1942, the British government took a small Scottish island in the Highlands, transported approximately 60 sheep to it, detonated bombs filled with anthrax spores above those sheep, and watched every one of them die within 3 days. The island is called Gruinard. It sits in a bay off the northwest coast of Scotland, about 1 kilometre from the mainland. It was surveyed, deemed suitable, and requisitioned from its owners by the Ministry of Supply. A team of 50 scientists from Porton Down's biology department, led by meteorologist Sir Oliver Graham Sutton, conducted the trials under the direction of biology department head Paul Fieldes. The anthrax strain selected was a highly virulent type called Volum 14578, named after a professor of bacteriology at the University of Oxford. The operation was part of a broader program called Operation Vegetarian, a plan to drop linseed cakes impregnated with anthrax spores over German farmland, infecting the cattle that would eat them, poisoning the food supply and triggering a cascading epidemic that would render parts of Germany uninhabitable for decades. The plan was never deployed, but the island was poisoned anyway. Scientists concluded after the trials that a large release of anthrax spores would thoroughly pollute German cities, rendering them uninhabitable for generations. Those conclusions were supported by the discovery that no effective method existed to decontaminate the island after the experiments ended. In 1945, when the owner sought the return of her island, the Ministry of Supply acknowledged that the contamination was such that it could not be handed back until declared safe. The promise made to the Dunphy family was simple. They or their heirs could repurchase Gruinard for £500 when it was declared fit for habitation by man and beast. It took 48 years. The island was quarantined, off limits to all visitors, ringed with warning signs, monitored periodically by Porton Down personnel from 1942 until 1990. The formal decontamination effort did not begin until 1986. 280 tons of formaldehyde solution diluted in seawater were sprayed across all 485 acres. The worst contaminated topsoil around the dispersal sites was physically removed. For years later, in April 1990, the last warning signs were taken down. The Dunphy heirs repurchased the island for the original sale price of £500, the same price paid in 1942. The island has never been inhabited since. Local fishermen and coastal communities knew for decades that something had happened on that island. The dead sheep washing up on the mainland shore in 1942 had been quietly explained away by the government's cover story. Greek sailors had dumped contaminated livestock from their vessel. The truth did not emerge publicly until 1981. When a group calling itself the Dark Harvest Commandos began depositing soil samples collected from Gruinard at strategic locations across England, including a sealed package left outside Porton Down itself, which tested positive for anthrax. The government refused a public inquiry. The decontamination eventually happened anyway, prompted not by accountability, but by the realization that further inaction was becoming politically untenable. Number 7. The Lyme Bay Trials, 1963 to 1975. Between 1963 and 1975, The microbiological research establishment at Porton Down conducted a series of outdoor trials in Lyme Bay, Dorset, in which live bacteria were sprayed from a ship and carried ashore by the prevailing wind. The agents used included Bacillus glabigii and Escherichia coli, described officially as less dangerous substitutes designed to simulate the dispersal pattern of an anthrax attack. The town of Weymouth lay directly downwind of the spraying. The trials were conducted without the knowledge or consent of the civilian population in the area. When the existence of the trials became public knowledge in the late 1990s, Dorset County Council, Weymouth and Portland Borough Council, and Purbeck District Council jointly demanded a public inquiry into the experiments and their potential effects on local residents. The government refused. It was later acknowledged that the bacteria used had adversely affected some vulnerable people. No inquiry was held. No compensation was offered. No public health assessment of the affected population was ever conducted. Number 6. The nerve agent program begins. October 1951. When Allied forces advanced through Germany in 1945, they discovered something that shocked the scientists who examined it. The German military had been developing nerve agents that were orders of magnitude more lethal than anything the Allies possessed. Tabun sarin, soman, organophosphorus compounds that attacked the central nervous system by blocking the enzyme acetylcholinesterase, causing the body's muscles to seize, its secretions to flood uncontrolled, its breathing to stop. Britain and its allies had known nothing of these agents' development. The shock of that discovery sent Porton Down in a new direction. By October of 1951, Porton Down had begun the first organized human trials of sarin on British servicemen. The volunteers were not told they were being exposed to a nerve agent. They were told, as they had always been told, that they were helping with research that might benefit their health. The first recorded serious adverse reaction occurred in February of 1953. Volunteer number 562 experienced effects severe enough to be documented. Testing continued. On the 27th of April 1953, 6 volunteers were given 300 milligrams of sarin each. One of them, a man named John Patrick Kelly, fell into a coma. He subsequently recovered. His superiors were advised to reduce the dosage to the lowest range, somewhere in the region of 10 to 15 milligrams. They reduced it to 200 milligrams instead. 9 days later, another 6 volunteers entered a gas chamber at Porton Down. One of them was number 7 for 5. Number 5. Ronald Maddison, the 6th of May, 1953. His name was Ronald George Maddison. He was born on the 23rd of January 1933 in Consett, County Durham. He was 20 years old. He was a leading aircraftman in the Royal Air Force working as a mechanic. He came to Porton Down because he was offered 15 shillings and 3 days of leave. He believed, as his fellow servicemen later testified under oath, that he was volunteering to help find a cure for the common cold. At 10 o'clock in the morning of the 6th of May, 1953, Maddison entered a sealed gas chamber at Porton Down with 5 other men. All 6 were wearing respirators. Each had 2 pieces of uniform cloth, serge and flannel tied loosely over their left forearms. 200 milligrams of liquid sarin were applied to the cloth on the inside of each man's arm. For 20 minutes, nothing visible happened. Then Maddison said he felt ill. He slumped forward. He was carried out of the chamber. An ambulance driver named Alfred Thornhill was called to assist. He later told the inquest what he saw. Maddison was convulsing and foam was coming from his mouth. The scientists and medical staff threw him onto the bed and gave him a large injection. The atmosphere, Thornhill said, was terrible. They were all panicking. They couldn't handle what they were looking at. Ronald Maddison died at 11 o'clock that morning. He was 20 years old. He had been inside the facility for less than 1 hour. The post-mortem was conducted at Salisbury Infirmary. On the 8th and 16th of May, an inquest was held. It was held in secret, before the Wiltshire coroner Harold Dale, on the grounds of national security. The verdict returned was misadventure. Maddison's father was permitted to attend. He was warned that he would be prosecuted under the Official Secrets Act if he informed anyone, including his own family, of the circumstances surrounding his son's death. Maddison's body was delivered to his family in a steel coffin with the lid bolted shut. A large number of samples, brain tissue, spinal cord tissue, skin, muscle, stomach, lung, gut, had been removed from his body without the family's knowledge or permission, and were used in further toxicology experiments over subsequent years. The Internal Court of Inquiry at Porton Down found that Maddison had died because of personal idiosyncrasy. Either he was unusually sensitive to the poison, or his skin had absorbed it faster than normal. The implication was clear. The experiment had not failed. The subject had. Number 4. The cover-up begins. May 1953 to 1999. What happened in the weeks and months after Ronald Maddison died is documented in correspondence that remained classified for decades and was only uncovered by investigators during Operation Antler. On the 1st of August 1953, Henry Woodhouse, a representative of the Treasury Solicitor's Office, reviewed the circumstances of Maddison's death and came to a conclusion that he set down in writing. He found a significant discrepancy between the procedures Porton was using to recruit volunteers, including the information provided to them about the nature and risk of the experiments, and the level of actual risk to which the subjects were being exposed. His written assessment stated that, in dealing with a dangerous and largely unknown substance like sarin, it would be difficult to show that there had been no negligence, and that the misleading statements made in invitations to volunteer, even if made in complete innocence, were always apt to give rise to criticism when anything had gone wrong. He concluded that the Crown was, in all likelihood, liable for Maddison's death. That assessment was classified. It did not reach the public for 50 years. Meanwhile, the testing at Porton Down continued. In the weeks after Maddison died, despite a ban endorsed by Prime Minister Winston Churchill, sarin tests continued in a mobile gas chamber. The program did not stop. It expanded. Between 1951 and 1989, approximately 3,400 servicemen participated in nerve agent trials at Porton Down alone. Across the full program, from 1949 to 1989, at least 20,000 people took part in various trials. The common cold remained, for decades, the official description of what they had volunteered to help cure. Number 3. The LSD experiments. The 1950s and 1960s. In the early 1950s, both the British and American governments became alarmed by intelligence suggesting that the Soviet Union was developing a so-called truth drug, a chemical agent capable of compelling spies or captured soldiers to reveal secrets, or of rendering entire units incapable of fighting. MI6 determined that lysergic acid diethylamide LSD was the closest candidate in the Western pharmacological arsenal. The solution was to test it. Servicemen were brought to Porton Down under the same premise that had been used for every experiment before. Research into the common cold, modest cash payment, days off leave. Instead, they were administered LSD without their knowledge. Some volunteers had terrifying hallucinations. None of them, by the accounts that subsequently emerged, were told what drug they had been given, what its effects would be, or why it was being administered. The research was carried out under the auspices of MI6. In November 1964, a platoon of Royal Marines from 41st Royal Marine Commando was given glasses of water laced with LSD as part of a military exercise. Film footage of the experiment exists. It shows the Marines struggling to carry out basic military tasks. The exercise descends into complete disarray. The footage was described by the Imperial War Museum as remarkable primary source material. For the men involved, the experience was rather different. In 2006, 3 former servicemen received out-of-court settlements from MI6 after claiming they had been given LSD without consent. Don Webb, who had been a 19-year-old airman at the time of his experiment, described the settlement as grudging. He said, MI6 stuck to the old maxim, never apologize, never explain. The documents relating to the full extent of the LSD program were not released into the public domain. The request by the veterans' lawyers for full disclosure was refused. Number 2. Operation Antler, 1999. For 46 years, the men who had been through Porton Down largely carried the experience alone. Some spoke about it to family members and were not believed or were told to forget it. Some attributed their declining health, respiratory problems, skin conditions, neurological symptoms, cancers, to other causes, because they had no way of knowing what they had been given. Some simply didn't know what they had been exposed to. The Official Secrets Act was a genuine barrier. The fear of prosecution was real. Then, in the summer of 1999, a single former serviceman came forward to the Wiltshire Constabulary with an allegation that he had been misled into chemical experiments at Porton Down under the pretense of common cold research. That one testimony became the foundation of Operation Antler, one of the largest police investigations in Wiltshire's history. Over the following years, more than 700 former servicemen and their relatives came forward. The investigation covered the period from 1939 to 1989. Police developed 25 cases for possible prosecution. 8 were forwarded to the Crown Prosecution Service. The CPS announced in 2003 that there was insufficient evidence to charge anyone. Not one scientist, not one commanding officer, not one minister faced prosecution. The only question the legal system ever formally resolved was the one about Ronald Maddison. And it took until 2004 to get that answer. Number 1, the second inquest, November the 15th, 2004. Ronald Maddison had been dead for 51 years, for months, and 9 days when a jury at Trowbridge in Wiltshire finally reached a verdict on the circumstances of his death. The second inquest had opened on the 5th of May 2000 and for 5 days before the 51st anniversary of his death. It heard evidence over 64 days. More than 100 witnesses testified. The jury heard from Alfred Thornhill, the ambulance driver who described in his own words what he had seen in that room. They heard from men who had stood in the same gas chamber that morning, men who had survived but who had never forgotten. They heard from historians, from scientists, and from the Maddison family, who had waited more than 5 decades for a public accounting of what had been done to a 20-year-old mechanic from Consett who had gone to Wiltshire for 15 shillings and 3 days of leave. On the 15th of November 2004, the jury returned its verdict. Ronald Maddison had been unlawfully killed. The cause of death was the application of a nerve agent in a non-therapeutic experiment. The verdict was unanimous. Outside the court, the Maddison family solicitor, Alan Kerr, said, "We have got justice." After 50 years, his family has finally found out that he was unlawfully killed by the state. Maddison's sister, Lilias Craik, told a reporter that Ronnie had not had a life. They took it away from him. She said, "They took a special part of our lives away, and they have said nothing about it ever since." She was right. After the verdict, the Ministry of Defence applied for a judicial review to quash the unlawful killing finding. In February 2006, an agreement was reached. The MOD accepted the inquest verdict on the grounds that Maddison had died through gross negligence in the planning and conduct of the experiment. The MOD paid the Maddison family £100,000 in compensation. No individual was charged with any offence. no criminal prosecution was ever brought. In 2008, Defence Minister Derek Twigg announced that 369 veterans would share a compensation fund of £3 million. In his written statement to Parliament, Twigg offered what he described as the government's first full apology. The government sincerely apologises to those who may have been affected. The phrase "those who may have been affected" covers 20,000 human beings who entered a military research facility on the promise of a modest payment and a few days of leave, and who were not told what was going to happen to them. No full public inquiry was ever held. The scientists involved in Maddison's experiment were never charged. Their names do not appear on any public register of accountability. The facility at Porton Down continues to operate today, occupying 7,000 acres of Wiltshire downland, conducting research under a mandate that is, as it has always been, largely classified. The men who went through its gates are now mostly old or gone. The question of what Britain's government owes them has been answered with money but never with truth. And the documents that might answer the remaining questions, the full extent of what was tested. On whom, under what instructions, with what knowledge of the risks, remain in archives that are not fully open. Porton Down is not a story that ended in 2004 when that jury came back with its verdict. It is a story that is still being written in silence on the same chalk downland, behind the same fence, under the same sky. The men are gone. The records are still locked away. And Britain has never fully explained what happened to the ones it was supposed to be protecting. Across all 25,000 of these cases, one pattern holds without exception. The men at the top knew. They knew the experiments carried risk. They knew the recruits had been misled. They knew the consent obtained was not meaningful. They documented their concerns in writing, classified those documents, and continued the program anyway. The British state did not experiment on its servicemen out of ignorance. It experimented on them out of calculation and then spent 50 years making sure no one could prove it. If you served, if your father served. If you know someone who was at Porton Down and came home with questions they were never allowed to ask, the comments below are open. The families are still looking for answers. Some of those answers are still classified.